So it is my pleasure to welcome our opening keynote and David Binkley Memorial Lecture speaker, Molly Sauter. Dave Binkley was a systems librarian from the 1980s until his death at the age of 53 from hepatitis in 2005. He was an early participant in the Access conferences and a remarkable innovator in automated online services in his day. He is best remembered for two things: the Aviso interlibrary loan system and the Godot article retrieval system. Developed while Dave was working at the University of Waterloo, Aviso was for many years the de facto standard for interlibrary loan management in Canada. Godot was developed while Dave was working at Simon Fraser University and incorporated into a citation resolution system similar to OpenURL. Dave's work represented the ideal of libraries taking ownership of their online services at a time when buying off-the-shelf software and putting it up with its limitations was the norm, not like today. After Dave's death, Gary Gibson of Gibson Library Connections honored his memory by offering a subsidy to the Access conference in Dave's name. The subsidy is used to bring in a speaker who would not normally attend Access, a voice from outside of our little circle. So, as I said, our speaker today is Molly Sauter. Molly is a Vanier Scholar and PhD student in Communication Studies at McGill University in Montreal. She holds a master's degree in Comparative Media Studies from MIT and is an affiliate researcher at the MIT Center for Civic Media at the MIT Media Lab and at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Molly.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank everybody for coming out on this lovely Toronto day. I don't know how far you guys had to walk, but it's really special today. So my name is Molly Sauter, and today I'm going to be talking about something that I call Public Computing and the Revolution, which is the title I come up with when someone asks me what the title is of my talk 3 months before I write it. I was like, I can talk about that for hours. Let's just talk about that. So who am I? I'm a PhD student at McGill. I live here now, though, which is cool. I study disruptive online activism. I study how people use the online space to talk about politics, to be political, and what the political philosophy is of technology. And I wrote this book. It's called The Coming Swarm: DDoS Actions, Hacktivism, and Civil Disobedience on the Internet. And it's about something called distributed denial of service, which, raise your hand if you know what that is. Ooh, you guys are awesome. So for the few of you who didn't raise your hand, distributed denial of service is when a group of computers all target one central server with the goal of bringing that server down and preventing that server from being accessed by other populations for whatever it is that that server has on it at the time. I'm particularly interested in how network communications technologies like the internet, but also like cell phone networks, create new spaces for political action and the practices and tools that people develop to take advantage of those spaces. So this book is primarily about DDoS as a tactic and how DDoS as a tactic has evolved over time. I'm not particularly going to talk about DDoS itself during this talk, but it's good for you to have a background in it. First, I want to talk about privately owned public spaces. So how many people recognize this photograph? So this is a picture of Zuccotti Park. How many people recognize that name? Cool. So Zuccotti Park was ground zero for Occupy Wall Street. And despite looking like a park and having the word park in its name, Zuccotti Park is not a public park. It's not owned by the city of New York. It's not managed by the state. It is what is called a privately owned public space, or POPS. And these spaces are very prevalent in New York, they're in San Francisco, they're in many major American cities, and we also have a good number of them here in Toronto. And they're a popular solution to a crisis of public space. Private companies and developers are given certain concessions in exchange for maintaining an area of their property as quote-unquote open to the public. Now, these cities often maintain a set of guidelines regarding accessibility and other aspects of maintenance and design for these spaces. So you have to have them open for a certain period of hours in the day. You have to maintain a certain percentage of publicly available seating. You're not allowed to make rules about outside food if you have an indoor space near a restaurant. But these spaces often have their own guidelines as well, usually enforced by private security guards. So here are two signs posted on two privately owned public spaces in New York City, Zuccotti Park and a space owned by Deutsche Bank. So as you can probably see, in reaction to Occupy Wall Street, Zuccotti's Park sign prohibits, quote unquote, lying down on the ground or on benches, camping or the placement of tarps or sleeping bags on the property, the use of skateboards, bikes, or rollerblades, and the removal of items from trash cans. The Deutsche Bank sign, which is the one, I guess it's the one that says privately owned public space on it instead of notice. It goes further. It prohibits loud or boisterous behavior, excessive use of space, whatever that is, and signs and posters. So the thing is about privately owned public spaces, it's right out there in front. They're private. As an individual, your use of these spaces is regulated by the laws of private property, contracts, and the whims of the corporation in question, not, say, by systems of rights, democratically passed legislation, or publicly answerable regulations which would govern a space that was owned by a city, state, or province. These not public spaces can be annoyingly restrictive if you're a skateboarder or a street performer, and they can be actively discriminatory and dangerous if you're homeless or a member of a group that is routinely targeted by law enforcement, or you make most of your income from something like picking cans out of trash to take to a recycling center. For a lot of people, though, they're moderately convenient ports in our daily storms if we notice them at all. So what this is a picture of it's a picture of the atrium at Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. So Trump Tower is owned by Donald Trump, and the Donald Trump Development Company was allowed to tack an extra 20 stories onto the Trump Tower in exchange for maintaining the ground floor level atrium as a publicly available space. That was roughly a third of the total height of the Trump Tower. So the publicly available space that was meant to be maintained was supposed to have marble benches, it was supposed to have stores, and sort of a place for people to come and hang out. And it's actually a quite beautiful space, if you can tell by the picture, this is from the New York Times. But it's clear that the developers and the people who own these spaces are the ones getting the sweet end of the deal. A recent survey by New York's Department of City Planning found that of the 503 existing privately owned public spaces in Manhattan, 16% of the spaces are actively used as regional destinations or neighborhood gathering spaces, 21% are usable as brief resting places, 18% are quote-unquote circulation related, which means that people primarily pass through them on their way to somewhere else, and 4% are being renovated or under construction, and 41% are a marginal utility, which means that nobody is using them and people don't even really know they're there. As for the marble benches that were mandated by the city for Trump Tower, they have currently been replaced with a Trump store where one can buy $15 Make America Great Again t-shirts and box sets of The Apprentice. So it's hard to enforce the mandates of privately owned public spaces. It's difficult for cities to say, here's what you have to do, and then enforce those rules. The marble benches and the Trump Tower atrium have actually been a point of contention for several years since the initial construction of the Trump Tower. The benches were first removed in 2008. The city attempted to level a $25,000 fine against the developers, and nothing else has really happened since then. The benches haven't been returned, and no further action by the city has been taken. So developers receive concessions and privileges in exchange for the construction of spaces, but then the maintenance and public use of these spaces is not continued to be enforced. So Molly, why are we talking about New York when we're supposed to be talking about the internet? The internet is a privately owned public space. So through tricks of evolution and choices of development, there are no public spaces online. When the internet was developed, it was developed by a group of pseudo-public, but primarily private entities, universities, groups like DARPA, entities like the FCC in the States. And then these were sort of pushed together into what we know as the public internet, or what we primarily interact with as the layer called the World Wide Web. The internet has many layers in its application stack, but we primarily deal with the stuff that has graphical user interfaces and things that we can read text on that's human readable and look at pictures of cats on. And that's the web layer. More than any other layer of the stack, that layer is basically entirely privately owned. There aren't any areas on that space that are controlled by what we would consider to be a public entity. So many of the rights and protections we might assume to be present when we exist and act on the internet are simply not available. And they simply do not apply because of the private nature of the internet. So, funny story. When I was much younger, I worked for a social networking site that will go unnamed presently. And my first job at this website was content moderation. How many people know what that means at a day? Awesome, you guys are my favorite. It meant that I got to delete inappropriate pictures from our website, which meant I saw lots of pictures of like people's junk on the internet, basically. Like it would be 9 o'clock in the morning, I'd be like, okay, that's the 6th picture of someone's junk I've seen today, who wants to take a coffee break? And everyone in the room would be like, me, me, me. So we would all go to get coffee. And we would get complaining emails from people whose inappropriate photos we had deleted. And they would say, you're violating my First Amendment right by deleting my incredibly artful picture of my junk. And I'd be like, that's not true. That's not accurate. And I would want to send them like a little pocket edition of the US Constitution, because we were based in the US, and be like, this is our server. We get to decide what we want to host on our server. You agreed to that by clicking through our terms of service when you signed up for our website. And no, we don't have to let you have that picture here. This is ironic now because I spend a lot of time talking about freedom of speech on the internet. And I get to tell this story where it's like, I used to have that job. I used to be the person who was trying to maintain what we considered to be our type of space that we wanted on the internet. However, this is actually a huge problem, because the assumption that our users had, granted they were all like 14-year-old boys, but the assumption that they had that their free speech rights would persist into the online space is not a faulty assumption. It's not necessarily a morally incorrect assumption. Just like how when you navigate the internet from the privacy of your own home, the assumption that some of the privacy protections you get by being in your home will follow you to the online space isn't necessarily a foolish assumption. It's an easily assumable assumption. People base their behavior on what their own personal context is. And if you're in a personal context that one says, of course someone's not gonna be collecting all this data about me. I'm in my home, I'm sitting by myself in my room. Why would someone be collecting whether or not my cell phone is running or staying still? How many people have Spotify here? It's like Spotify's it's a music streaming service that attempts to get around the fact that it's really hard to pay artists right now. You pay a subscription fee, it gives you music, everyone is theoretically happy unless you're Taylor Swift. And recently, if you have Spotify on your phone, I have Spotify on my phone, they pushed a new terms of service. So terms of service is a click-wrap agreement. You click a button that says, yes, I approve of these terms of service, please just take my $10 a month, I really want to listen to music right now. And you don't read it, no one reads them. And in this terms of service, they are saying they have the right to the photos on your phone, whether or not your phone is running or walking or standing still, because they want to know when you're they want to use accelerometer data to know how you're using their service, access to your address book, a bunch of other things. It's a very invasive data grab. There's no reason why I would assume as a user, oh, if I want to listen to music while I'm running, clearly the service that is providing me streaming data for my music wants to know if I'm running or not. And they want to know where I am. And they can have access to that data because I clicked a button. So these assumptions about the freedom of speech and privacy are not foolish. but we're simply not forced to reckon with the extreme amount of privacy and rights and freedoms that we give up when we interact with corporate spaces on an everyday level. So we have these things called click-wrap agreements, which are a sort of online variation on shrink-wrap agreements. If you open this package, you agree to these terms of service that we used to get with software. So now we just have click-wrap. You click through it, and you are then beholden to that contract. And these are called contracts of adhesion. So they're called contracts of adhesion because they just adhere to you as you're walking around. Has anyone ever gone into a park where someone was filming something, where a television show was being filmed, and you walk past a thing at the entrance to the park that says, "The television show Damages is currently filming an episode in this park. If you enter this park, you agree to give 20th Century Fox the rights to your image in perpetuity." The end. It's like, well, I wanted to go to the park today, and then I read that, and now I'm not so sure, but I still want to go to the park today, so shrug. And we also see these things in terms of liability waivers, or you walk into a amusement park or a restaurant or something else, and you see a liability waiver on the wall that says, "We do not claim any liability. If you trip and fall down, we are not liable." And these liability waivers are a protection duck on the part of the establishment. They're saying, we said it. We said you were liable for your own behavior. Therefore, you can't sue us. Other things that come up a lot are things called binding arbitration agreements. If you want to really freak yourself out, go read any fine print contract you've ever clicked through or signed, like getting a credit card or actually Spotify. I was reading the Spotify agreement this morning to figure out exactly what I had clicked through so I could tell you guys about it. They have a two-part binding arbitration agreement. So arbitration is a parallel legal procedure to getting your damages, to going to court with your complaint. If a corporation is mean to you or does something that violates your rights, theoretically you're supposed to be able to sue them. Binding arbitration says, no. We're not going to go to court. We're going to go to binding arbitration where the arbiter is hired by the corporation in question, and they're going to decide who's right and who's wrong. So if you have a problem with Spotify, you go to binding arbitration. If Spotify thinks you're pirating their content, they're going to court. And they're going to court in San Francisco. And so you have this double bind of a corporation saying, well, here's how we're going to deal with your problems, but here's how we're going to deal with my problems. And none of these are to your benefit. So all of these different arrangements that we have that both occur sort of IRL in these privately owned public spaces occur that much more in the online space, because there is no walking around the park in the online space. If I decide I don't want to give 20th Century Fox rights in perpetuity to my face and my dog's face, I don't have to take my dog to that park that day. I can walk around the park, I can go to a different park, but there's no way to get around those spaces on the internet. Instead, if you don't want to let Facebook mine your statuses for data it can use to either sell you products or sell you as a user to a different corporation, sucks to be you. You cannot be on Facebook, and your mom can call you every day to make sure you're alive instead of checking your Facebook status, which is why I have Facebook. There's no way around it. So these agreements are impossible to opt out of, and they're impossible to meaningfully negotiate. And they're also equally impossible to completely understand unless you have a law degree and a job that pays you to understand terms of services. So these are all attempts to control, direct, and regulate user behavior for the benefit of the corporations that are controlling those spaces. So your behavior is being funneled through a series of controls, both semi-legal, social, and technological. How many people have autocomplete on their phone? You ever notice how it won't let you curse? Like, it won't autocomplete curse words, and you end up being really angry and saying duckity duck, 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 and then the person you're mad at is like, what? I thought we were having an argument. It's like, now, no, we're going to the petting zoo. So these measures are meant to make you the most profitable bit of data producing automaton for the corporation that's currently handling your data. When these measures fail and users act outside of the dictated parameters in ways that damage the profitability of that corporation, those problem users, who may be hackers, who may be security researchers, who may be activists, who may be bored teenagers, who might just be you, are often removed from the platform, sometimes with little warning or explanation, and despite whatever investment they have personally built up within that particular internet fiefdom, and often no way to extract the value that they've put in. So there's no way to cleanly extract your data. There's no way to migrate your data from one thing to another. How many people are currently trapped in iTunes because they can't find a way to get their playlists out? I have no idea how to get my playlists out of iTunes, and I'm trapped there forever now. Thanks. So sometimes when you are spontaneously removed from a platform, these are for moralizing or social policing infractions, like you've posted pictures that depict breastfeeding on Instagram, or these are for trackability reasons, such as claiming a name that doesn't follow the typical Anglo-European format of given name, family name on Google+ or Facebook. I tried recently to change my name on Facebook to initials. Apparently, you're not allowed to have initials for your first name on Facebook. It just won't accept the input. It says, nope, that's not your name. I don't care why you want this. You can't have it. Sometimes these reasons are semi-legal, such as when YouTube receives a DMCA takedown notice. How many people are familiar with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act? Yes. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act established things called safe harbors, which means that when a content service like YouTube or LiveJournal, if anyone still uses LiveJournal, Facebook, receives a copyright claim, they are legally incentivized to remove the content as quickly as possible. They are not incentivized to engage in a good faith investigation of like, is this a copyrightable piece of material? Is this fair use? Do we think that this is actually a pirated copy of The Bourne Identity, or do we think this is a fan thing? They're not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to remove it immediately, or they lose what's called safe harbor protections, which protect them from being sued for copyright infringement for the actions of their users. Sometimes there isn't a clear reason why you're being removed from a platform, and there is actually no requirement for there to be, because you don't have a right to be there. You are there by the grace of whoever is maintaining that platform. Sometimes you're forced to abandon a platform because of the graphic rape and death threats and doxes that you're receiving every day aren't recognized by the platform as a violation of their terms of service, despite the fact that they've caused you to flee your home out of fear for your own safety. The validity of behavior is not determined whether or not it is transgressive or dangerous. It is whether or not that behavior is transgressive enough to determine a security reaction on the part of the corporation, which is mostly determined by how likely it is to negatively impact a company's bottom line. So this is something that's been coming up very recently with Twitter. Twitter is bad at harassment. It's very bad at noticing when its users are being harassed or being silenced or being otherwise treated extraordinarily badly by other users. And this is for a reason. It's really hard to determine when someone is saying, I'm going to come to your house and cut off your head as a threat, versus someone else saying, gee, I wish my mom hadn't bitten my head off this morning about cleaning my room. That's a difficult problem. It's a difficult computing problem. That being said, there's also not a lot of work being done on the part of these corporations to determine how to solve that problem. Instead, what we're getting is a lot of offloading of this type of monitoring activity to third parties, because it's a very upsetting problem. So you have a lot of people saying, gee, it's really bad that women are getting harassed off of Twitter by people who really care about journalism and games. What should we do about it? Well, how about we start a third-party advocacy and monitoring group that enables people to block people who have been blocked by lots of other people like them? which is great. I think that third parties attempting to figure out this problem is certainly better than nobody attempting to solve this problem, but it also means that we're offloading the responsibility of monitoring and protecting people online to really eager advocacy volunteer organizations, rather than saying that it is the responsibility of the people who run these platforms to take care of their users who they've accepted into their own personal fiefdom. So we have a situation where we've built a system that relies on private contracts and the norms of private property to regulate a space that is overwhelmingly becoming a central hub for the personal and political expression and activism of a global population on a global scale. Policing this space has defaulted to those entities with both the biggest investment in the space and the capital on hand to defend this investment, which is the commercial corporations themselves. The security apparatus of the current internet is constructed and maintained to the specifications of corporate actors and to protect and maximize potential profits, not to enforce actual secure practices, norms, or structures, and certainly not to protect the privacy and established rights of people using the sites. What's more, the laws that have been built up around the internet are based within this paradigm. So on the one hand, we have an extremely robust and entrenched private policing structure. And on the other hand, we have a system of public laws that, when they do exist, primarily exist to hold up that structure. They don't exist to combat it or to shift power away from the private sector. They exist to support that private sector themselves. And they're exceedingly poorly constructed to react appropriately to the actions of users themselves, particularly when those users are behaving in ways that are not dictated by the security forms and the expected practices that the corporations have put forward. And this is a particular problem when you have activist groups, when you have hacker or security researcher groups that are behaving in unexpected ways and using technology and what I call non-traditional technology uses. It's just simply not terribly well equipped to respect their rights and reasonable expectations. In the privately owned public spaces of the modern internet, data about roughly every aspect of our online behavior is routinely collected, analyzed, sold, and resold, with the goal of increasing the profitability of companies that control that space. Our behavior is directed and restricted by terms of service or click wrap agreements, try saying that 5 times fast, and with the designed affordances of the technologies themselves. But our continued presence in this space isn't a given. It is too at the pleasures of the owners of the privately owned public internet. Molly, this is depressing. What does this have to do with public computing? So there's a lot packed into the phrase public computing. And I'd like to spend the rest of this talk unpacking some of the implications of the various concepts of public computing and help us conceive of modes of resistance to the exploitative nature of what I'm calling the publicly owned private internet. And so first, I would like to talk about distributed or crowd computing, and then I'd like to talk about different ways of obfuscating surveillance and surveillance refusal, and finally, I'd like to talk about collective disruptive action. How many people recognize this particular interface? Yay, nerds! So this is SETI at Home. SETI at Home was launched in 1999. It was one of the first major distributed computing projects. I actually think it was the second major, so it was one of the first because it was the second, distributed computing projects. What it was a really pretty screensaver that let you use your idle computing time to analyze radio signals from the SETI project. So you could look for aliens while you sleep, basically, is what you could do. And such distributed computing projects utilize the wide distribution of extremely powerful technology that exists on your home computer to make process on research projects like SETI at Home that are underfunded or that are simply too computationally expensive for your average computer lab to really deal with. One example of this is Stanford's Folding at Home, which is a protein folding computational program. So it exists to figure out how all the myriad ways that proteins can fold and what that can do for medicine and science. You're looking for cures to things like Huntington's disease and that kind of thing. It's simple, like the amount of variations of protein folding is, I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with protein folding more than the Wikipedia entry I read on it yesterday, there are just a truly unreal number of variations on this. It is too computationally expensive for even Stanford to run a dedicated computer lab to figuring this out. So instead, they access the computational power that all of us have at our fingertips and distribute that, just making it much more possible. There have been a variety of other projects that take advantage of idle computing time and what we now know as the always-on internet that most of us have in our homes to sort of deal with this. But, so distributed computing projects allow people to come together as crowds. There's cloud computing, this is crowd computing. But it still happens within the auspices of the privately owned public internet. These are still operating within the structures that have been set up. By participating in these projects, we are doing good, but we are still propping up these legal and distributive and technological structures. There are interesting ways to subvert this. For instance, everyone used to know how to send a fax. Now when I need to send a fax, I usually have to look it up or ask someone nice. But sending faxes used to be an office skill. You had it because you worked in an office. You had it because you were taking part in what we would call the capitalist extraction of labor value. It wasn't a personal skill. And it wasn't a political skill until Anonymous started sending black faxes to the Church of Scientology. How many people know what a black fax is? It's a black piece of paper you tape into a circle and then you fax it to somebody and you use up all their toner. And it just goes forever. Which is pretty cool. Like, it's a way of subverting skills that are being taught as a way of propping up a capitalist structure to help to bring down or help to interrupt the processes of that structure. And that's one way that this distributed computing can potentially subvert what is otherwise pretty cool and useful, but also still ultimately supportive of the privately owned public internet space. The other problem with the privately owned public internet is that it is inherently a surveillance machine. The value, everyone has heard of, if you're not buying something, you're the product. How many people have Gmail? Yeah, they mine I have Gmail. Google mines your emails to find out what cool things to sell to you. Google mines every single one of your, there's a page you can go to on Google that will tell you who Google thinks you are and what it thinks you like. Google thinks I'm a guy because I like the internet and Chinese food. So it's not perfect, but they're trying. So what happens here is that we are constantly putting off a fume of data exhaust. We are just shedding data every time we go online, every time we open up a computer, every time we type into something that is then going to be helpful for us. So I'm just going to keep using Google as a negative example because it's basically everywhere. How many people use Google Maps to figure out where they're going? How many people have their home programmed into Google Maps? I mean, it's super convenient. You don't have to type in, I want to go from the place where I am always to a different place, to type in place I am always, new different place. And it's convenient when you don't have to do that. It's convenient when your phone already knows where you are, so you can say, I want to know how to get from, you don't have to say, I want to get from the Toronto Reference Library to dinner. It's, I want to get from where I am now to dinner, and all you have to know is dinner. But Google has also been keeping track of where you are ever since it launched something called Google Latitude, which was, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago. And there's now a interface where you can go in, and if you had Google Latitude enabled on your phone, which if you didn't disable it, you have it enabled, and it can tell you everywhere you've been in the last 5 years with your phone. And you can download it as a cute little map, and you can look at it and get really freaked out for a couple of minutes, and then probably, like most of my friends, immediately start sharing, like, I was here the most. I was at the gym the most. I spent all of my time at the lab. Everyone knew that. But these are all just things we shed. We just shed them. They're like bits of hair or skin or equally gross things that we shed all the time. We don't notice that we're throwing them off. Other people notice that we're throwing them off. Mostly autonomous systems notice that we're throwing them off. And one of the things that the privately owned public internet is built on is particularizing individuals into data profiles. So taking you from being a person and reducing you down to being an isolated stream of productive, identifiable data points that can be easily extrapolated into consumer profiles or usage profiles or anything that can be then packaged and sold or reanalyzed to predict something else to package and sell to you. So one mode of resistance to this is obfuscation. Obfuscation is the injection of noise into the data stream, which makes it difficult to tell signal from that noise. It makes it difficult to say, this is an important data point, this is pointless. And on an individual level, there are browser plugins that you can download and use to inject noise into your own personal data stream. These are things called, there's one called Ad Nauseam and one called Track Me Not, and they don't operate on security by obscurity. They don't hide your traffic. They just run in the background and run pointless searches in the background of your browser. They click on ads that you don't click on, just to make it that much more difficult to figure out what you're actually doing if you were someone tracking your web traffic inside that wave of noise. On a larger level, how many people have heard of PGP? You guys are still my favorite. So PGP is a mode of encryption that a lot of people use. It's the most popular mode of encryption. It's also really difficult to use, but if you want to figure out how to deal with it, it's mostly worthwhile. If you use PGP to encrypt your email traffic, say, and none of the other people in your area use PGP, anyone who cares to be looking for someone using encrypted email is going to pick you out real easy. It's like a big flag saying, I think I have something to hide. If a bunch of people in your area use PGP, it's that much harder to figure out who is using it because they think that they have reason to use it. So whenever anyone asks me, Molly, how can I, Joe Schmo, who's not an activist, sort of help out with data activism, one of the things I always say is use PGP when you don't need to. Because your simple addition of your additional PGP noise further obfuscates the actions of activists around you or the actions of people who think they need to use encryption. So obfuscation works on several levels. The first level is personal data obfuscation, where you are obfuscating what you are doing to protect your privacy. And then there's the social level of obfuscation, or the herd immunity of obfuscation. If enough people use it, it's hard to pick out the people who are actually in danger from their governments or other people using that mode of protection. So PGP encryption or the use of Tor or other quote-unquote advanced security practices help deal with trimming and reducing the amount of data that can be readily harvested from individuals by the privately owned public internet and anyone else who might be watching for whatever reason. Finally, I want to talk about collective disruptive activism. So this is my own personal graphical representation of what a DDoS is. We have the sad server computer who's being targeted by all of the other computers who are sending streams of nonsense signals at it, and it can't handle it and it falls down. So DDoS actions and other actions of that type are, I found, one of the only ways to successfully render what I'm going to call presence online. So the Electronic Disturbance Theater was one of the major groups involved in the use and propagation of DDoS actions as a form of activism. They started in the late 1990s and have continued through the early 2000s. They ran a lot of actions in support of the Zapatistas, who, if anyone is interested in sort of the online use of computers as a tool of activism, actually the Zapatistas had a huge amount of online political activity that is super interesting if you're a nerd like me. And they also had an action in 1999 in support of a group called eToy. So eToy was a really interesting case. It was a copyright case involving whether or not a corporation could bully someone out of a domain. So there was a toy company called eToys, and then there was eToy, who was a performance art collective out of Europe. And eToys wanted the eToy URL because Christmas was coming up and they were afraid that people would click on etoy.com and then get really confused by how they couldn't buy toys there and then would give up. This was in the late 1990s, so it was before online commerce really took off. So they launched a trademark lawsuit against eToys, and it was a high-profile lawsuit at the time, and if you're interested in copyright law and online copyright, it still remains sort of a definitive moment in jurisprudence. So the Electronic Disturbance Theater launched a project they called the 12 Days of eToy, which was a 12-day-long DDoS action against etoys.com to bring the site down during the peak of the Christmas shopping season. And they said that their action was meant to represent the presence of a global group of people gathering to bear witness to a wrong. And regardless of the sort of grandiose rhetoric of that sentence, it does bring us to the problem of presence. So the problem of presence online is actually a pretty deep problem. It's very difficult to be present in an online infrastructure without being also complicit in that infrastructure. It's hard to be there without using and contributing financially to the structure, either because you're actively paying someone something or because your simple presence and simple ability to be there is monetizable. So the EDT and other groups like the electro hippies, who were also an early proponent of DDoS actions, were proponents of legitimacy through mass action. The meaning and vitality of their actions was drawn from the simultaneous presence and action of thousands of people, not necessarily from any actual or extended effect that that action may have had on a targeted site. So this was in the 1990s. It was pretty easy to bring a site down by looking at it funny. Like, if you went to whitehouse.gov and looked at it for too long, it might just crash. It's harder to do that now. This doesn't mean that DDoS has become a less effective form of activism, primarily because it doesn't really matter if the site goes down. Right now, what it matters in a lot of DDoS actions is whether or not the press pays attention to you. And since 2010, the press have been primed to view DDoSes as newsworthy events. So in this sense, it's relatively unimportant to groups like the Electronic Disturbance Theater whether a given action was successful in that it brought a site down or not. EDT member and academic Stephen Ray notes that FloodNet, which was the DDoS tool designed and used by the EDT in the 90s and early 2000s, rarely resulted in actual downtime for targeted sites, and as such, its value lay mostly in the symbolic gesture of the simulated threat. So the number of participants and the amount of media coverage the action attracted were the most relevant factors in the judgment of whether an action was a success or a failure. DDoS actions like the EDTs and other more recent actions like those of Anonymous can be seen as an attempt to reassert a fundamental view of the internet as a public forum in the face of its designation as private property. The privately owned public internet attempts to render impossible presence without complicity and participation. One is always throwing off data that can be capitalized, and one's presence can always be counted as monetizable traffic. And a collective disruptive action like a DDoS subverts that order, manifesting as purely impactful, uncapitalizable presence. You cannot capitalize downtime unless you are a company that exists to prevent downtime. So most of all, collective disruptive actions like DDoS enable activists to occupy a confrontational space that is parallel to the space that is occupied by the actual target. And this is one of the only things that enables people to stand on the same level as these corporations. Now, one of the things that I'm doing in my research is I'm looking at how conversations can happen, or most often can't happen, between different structures of power. So as an individual, can you talk to a corporation or a state government in a meaningful way? Is that even possible? And so one of the things that these actions allow people to do is actually hoist themselves onto a parallel power structural level to these corporations, because rendering them incapable of communicating from that platform is one of the only ways of enforcing an actually structured attempt at exchange. And we can shout about that for as long as you want. I shout about it with lots of people. It's not a hugely popular view. But what this enables people to do is say, you have to reckon with our presence rather than monetize our complicity. So though sites like Facebook are extraordinarily powerful in terms of political organizing in places where it's difficult to assemble large groups of people in one spot, which is why a lot of people have the reaction of like, well, you shouldn't organize your protest on Facebook if Facebook's gonna shut you down. It's like, well, Facebook is where all the people are. In a lot of places, Facebook is the only place where you can actually access that large number of people and organize them, particularly in non-Western countries. So the argument that Facebook is not a productive tool of political organizing is, in many ways, a very limited argument in terms of political viewpoint. But if we are talking about actually confronting organizations and corporations where they live, this type of collective disruptive action is one of the only ways to do this. Now, this is not to say it is not risky, legally dubious. It is all of these things. It is also very prone to being co-opted by groups who don't particularly care about confronting corporations where they live and are far more interested in silencing speech online. There's a great report from the Berkman Center at Harvard about this, which came out in 2010, about the vulnerability of independent media groups to DDoSes. DDoSes are very expensive to defend against, and most ISPs simply won't. They'll say, you, tiny independent media organization, you are very expensive. I will no longer host you. Thank you. And that's another example of how the privately owned public internet disregards and actively discourages dissent. It simply says, well, are you risky? We will not host you. But it does allow activists to, actions like this do allow activists to use the force of crowds in the way that we're used to seeing in the street and move that power to the online space. So, distributed computing, obfuscation and security refusal, and tactics like DDoS rely on a notion that computing is something that can and that ought to be done collectively and to a shared purpose as a public. So I'm talking about public computing not in the sense of I am sitting with my computer in public and using it, or that I have publicly available computing resources, but rather it looks at computing as something that can be done as a group that is operating to a shared purpose, and not merely as a collection of individuals who all happen to be interested in funny cat gifs at the same time. This as the obligatory cat picture, which I understand is required at this conference. And I think I'm gonna leave it there, and we have some time for a Q&A, which I'm totally happy about. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for listening to me. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Yes. I've been asked to repeat the questions for the live stream. I know it's early. Yes. So the question was, how do I respond to nation-state responses in the realm of astroturfing. So for those of you who don't know, astroturfing is the bad version of grassroots activism. It's when you have people posting a bunch of comments or reviews or content that supports something, but they don't really support it. They're being paid. So this is very popular among various nation states. China has something called the 5-cent or 50-cent army, depending on when you're reading that article, of people who are paid to post content and to get into fights with people online. There's also a slightly different form of this type of action called sea lioning, which is when you and a bunch of people start yelling at the same person on Twitter about why they won't engage with you in a perfectly reasonable conversation about the ethics of game journalism. That's an interesting question, because cyber war, as much as I am loath to use that term, is something that occurs on a different level than activism. And while the same tactics can be co-opted, that doesn't mean necessarily that the validity of those tactics when used by individuals at an activist level is tainted necessarily. When it becomes a problem is when you have confusion, usually in the media, about the difference between cyber war, cyber crime, and political activism. And this is something that I deal with in my book, because DDoS has a visibility problem. DDoS has a respectability problem. For a while there, in around 2010 through 2012, so while I was writing the book, it was very popular for people who were reporting on DDoS to talk about it like it was political. There had been a shift in how journalists view this type of action, and a lot of things were being called political DDoSes that maybe necessarily weren't. And now that's sort of gone back again, and we're talking more about DDoS as crime than we are as a political action. And so that's where the real danger comes in for people who are using this as an activist tactic, is in that level of semantic confusion. So while I find stuff like the 50-cent army and astroturfing to be super interesting from a media studies and from a political theory perspective, its relevance to the political use of these tactics is, I think, mostly relevant in the confusion that it causes and less in the actual ethics of its use, if that makes sense. Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
Do you think there's a way to do political activism in an organized way outside of sites like Facebook and Twitter? There's like a real kind of irony there, right?
Yeah, so the question is, do I think it's possible to do organized political activism on sites outside of Facebook and Twitter? So how many people remember Diaspora? Yeah, so Diaspora was supposed to be the open Facebook. It was supposed to let you take your own data, you would maintain your own Diaspora node, and people would be free and unsurveilled, and it was gonna be great. There were like 5 people on it, and I knew 4 of them. So Facebook has network effects on its side. Everybody is there. And so if you want to organize people, you go to where, like, it's organizing 101. If you want to organize people, you go to where the people are. So if this was like the 1920s and you wanted to organize unemployed people into unions, you went to bread lines, or you went to unemployment centers. If you wanted to organize a union of steel workers, you went to the steel mill, because that was where they were. And now we have a bunch of problems where we forced a massive distribution of labor, and we forced a massive distribution of people, but they come together in these social sites. And so if people want to engage in organizing, this is often the easiest place to do it. And it is a huge problem, because you are then buying into this structure, and you have to balance that by saying, well, is it more worthwhile for me to be here, or is it more worthwhile for me to be engaging in another type of organization, say on a local level, or through a different type of site? So we also have petition sites, like We the People is a major petition site in the US that is actually has a connection to the US government where if a petition gets a certain number of signatures, it will force a response. They made a commitment to respond to petitions that reach a certain level of popularity. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. I'm not necessarily sure how much I love the idea of a petition site being run by the federal government. That doesn't make me super happy. But if you want to engage in that system, that's a good way to do it, by going to where the attention is. So there is, you're right, there is sort of an unavoidable irony of the popularity and utility, because I don't want to just say that they're popular. Facebook and Twitter are actually useful in terms of organizing these types of things, especially when what you're trying to organize is people who are non-professionalized, people who haven't been professionalized into activism. You go to where they live, which is another reason why DDoS and Anonymous was so popular and why people got really excited about it, because it opened up this whole new world and whole new style of activism in the place where they lived. Like, I like to say that my hometown is the internet. Like, my actual hometown is New Hope, Pennsylvania, but I spend way more time on the internet than I think I maybe ever spent like out in the social world of my hometown. So in many ways, like, that's where I live. That's where all my friends are. That's where I hang out a lot. I spend my free time there. I'm fluent in internet. And so if you want to find that group of people, you go to where they live. So it depends on what you want to be doing and how you want to be dealing with your target population. So if you want to find people who are on Facebook, you go to Facebook. If you want to find people who are on Twitter, you go to Twitter. But yeah, you're right that it is just unavoidably ironic. Anybody else? Yes.
This is a very tech-oriented question, but for this kind of online direct action that you talk about, what kind of tools would it be nice to have that we don't have? Like if we were going to go out and build stuff theoretically.
For like disruptive collective action? So there are a number of tools that have already been developed. They all have weird problems. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the EDT developed a tool called FloodNet, which was the first public-facing DDoS tool. You can basically run a DDoS with anything. When DDoS first started being popular, it was literally like, okay, everybody, show up at whitehouse.gov at noon tomorrow and hit refresh a bunch of times. And do that for an hour, and then we'll all go home. That was how you ran a DDoS in 1994. And it worked sometimes, because internet, 1994. And then after that, the EDT developed this tool called FloodNet, which, if we want to get super technical, ran on the Java applet reload function. So it would just reload Java applets over and over and over and over. I know, it's funny. Just reload them over and over and over again. And again, internet, 1990s, it worked a lot of the time. One time they tried to run that against the Pentagon. The Pentagon didn't like that, so they unleashed an app that they called the hostile applet function and crashed the EDT's server that was running FloodNet, which turned out to be a bit of a thing because it was the first deployment of a quote-unquote cyber weapon against a civilian population in the US. People didn't really like that. And then there are tools that have popped up in more modern times, like the tool that Anonymous uses is called the Low Orbit Ion Cannon, or the tool that they used during the 2010 DDoS actions. It's since been replaced by something called the High Orbit Ion Cannon. And what that does is it just sends a bunch of ping requests. And it operates at several levels, none of which I'm going to get into right now, but basically, there are many different ways to run a DDoS. I'm not going to explicitly tell you to do it right now because it's a felony in the States, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's also the equivalent of a felony here, but I wouldn't be surprised. So if you were to engage in this type of activism, you just need to be able to send a bunch of requests to a given server at one time. There are some blog platforms where if you run 3 simultaneous search requests, the blog will go down because search requests are super resource intensive. There are lots of ways to bring down a site if you want to. More corporate sites are harder to bring down because they both have dedicated security and are often employing, if they are a targeted company, if they're a company that expects to be targeted, they will often employ DDoS mitigation services, who essentially just provide extra servers to soak traffic, because that's the most efficient way to deal with a lot of these actions, is just say, oh, you're gonna send a lot of traffic to me? I will give Akamai thousands and thousands of dollars and they will give me some of their servers. We can also talk about this in more technical detail later. We have 4 more minutes. You can also take the 4 minutes to drink coffee if you want. Right. All right, thank you guys so much. It was really fun talking to you.
All right, guys, we are on break. So I forgot to bring my sheet. I don't know how long it is. I will let you know in like a minute. We are working on the power situation. Bear with us. We'll have more of it. There is never enough, but we are getting some more. And enjoy the break, and we'll reconvene when we reconvene. Thank you very much.